On today's episode, we will mark the 8th anniversary of the Parkland school shooting, and we will be discussing where we go from here with Parkland parent Ryan Petty. So my guest today is someone that I came to know while I was running for state legislature in Tallahassee. You see, I went to Tallahassee as a strong Second Amendment supporter, and I actually promised to repeal what I consider to be some of the bad parts of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Act. But I wanted to run my opinions by people. I wanted to be sure that what I was feeling was, in fact, the right thing to do. So I reached out to many people, including this man, Ryan Petty, by text, by phone, by social media, because if anyone's opinion on this topic should carry more weight than anyone else's, it is this man. Ryan Petty, thank you for agreeing to be part of this podcast.
Yeah, Dr. Rudman, it's great to see you as always, and thank you for the invitation.
So, Ryan, I'd be remiss if I didn't start by telling you how sorry I am for your loss. There are certain things that will follow me for the rest of my life from serving in the legislature. Elena's name is one of those. I'll always remember Gina. Of course, Chris Hickson, Alex Schachter. There's just some things that stick with you. But I have to be honest, as a Republican, okay, and as someone who spent time in the Florida House, I would sometimes get the feeling that it was almost taboo for a Republican to express the remorse that I'm expressing now, almost as if political parties had made it off limits for certain politicians or certain groups to invoke those names. And so I'm wondering, was that my imagination, or did you see the bias as well that, the Democratic Party, they seem to want to kind of lay claim to their stake on this territory? And I guess maybe as Republicans, we're not allowed to grieve. We're not allowed to support the Second Amendment and also express a desire to not have any more Parklands.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, Dr. Rudman, and I think, the left tends to lay claim to these types of tragedies. They do so because they feel very confident that they know the answer. And they only have one answer for these, right? And that is a restriction on the Second Amendment freedoms and liberties that we have as Americans, our rights. And so they, quite honestly and without shame, will use tragedy, including victims, to push forward their agenda. So I think they're more comfortable dealing with it in that situation because they feel like they've got the answer. I think for Republicans, for conservatives, for those of us that care about liberty, it's an uncomfortable place because part of the answer is these are tragedies that happen because of evil in the world, and there isn't anything necessarily that government can do about them to stop them entirely, right? Government cannot make us 100% safe and secure. So it's that kind of ambiguity or that area that I think Republicans sometimes and conservatives feel uncomfortable dealing with these situations because it's so easy to say there ought to be a law, right? But let's not forget that the individual that killed my daughter Elena broke many laws in the lead up to that, not the least of which was capital murder. He killed 17 and tried to kill hundreds that day. There's already laws on the books to prevent that. Well, prevent is the wrong word, but to make that illegal. But that doesn't stop evil from finding a way. And so I think for for most of us on the conservative side, we sort of want to do more and feel like maybe what we can do and what we should do isn't enough. And that's probably the awkwardness that many conservatives feel in these situations.
Well, and I certainly don't want to relive that day. I certainly don't want to talk about the day itself, but rather I'd like to ask you what the aftermath was like, Ryan, because, I wasn't involved in politics by that point. I was just a regular citizen when I heard the news. Uh, I'm not embarrassed to tell you that my wife was one of those people calling Tallahassee to find out what can we do to make this less likely. So if you wouldn't mind telling our viewers, what was it like in the days after? I mean, are we talking about an already tight-knit community? Did the parents already know each other anyway? Whose idea was it to take this fight to Tallahassee? And what was that like to walk the halls of Tallahassee right after this event?
Yeah, it was, as I look back on all of those days, they're surreal in my mind, right? I couldn't tell you which way was up in
Mhm.
in the week after losing Elena. We were just trying to hold it together as a family, to be quite honest. Trying to do our best to ignore what was happening in the news media and everything else, and just trying to be there for each other. That was the most important thing. To answer your question about the families, no, we didn't know each other before. There were some families that were familiar with each other that did know each other, but I didn't know any of the other Parkland families. Um, so what we were trying to do is just come together as a family and be there for each other and support each other. And we had some absolutely wonderful friends and neighbors, friends from church, family members. Boy, my high school one of my best friends from high school, my college roommate, and a guy I started a company with when we got out of college. He dropped everything and flew out here and just took care of us. Just sort of became the guy that was the intermediary between everything that was going on, the chaos of the world, and what we needed. And I'm forever grateful for those friendships and for those acts of service that were rendered on, you know, behalf of my family. Um, it wasn't very long after that I got a call. In fact, I'll never forget, we were at the funeral home selecting Elena's casket when I got a call from Governor Rick Scott.
Hmm.
And he called to express his condolences. And I'd never met him personally. I had been in some. He had actually come to a company that I worked for prior to Parkland and talked about jobs. You remember Rick Scott was all about jobs, 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 right? That was what
Right.
he talked about, and he was highlighting the company I was working at the time. But I'd never met him personally. But I could tell on that phone call he was absolutely not only devastated, but 100% sincere in his concern for me and for my family and what we were going through. And his question to me was, he said, "Ryan, I think there's some things we can do to prevent this from happening again. Would you be willing to help me make that happen?" And he went on to, I think, excuse me if I wasn't up to it or couldn't do it or whatever. But he said, "I think it's very important that your voices are heard at this, in Tallahassee."
Hmm.
And so I said, "Let me talk with my wife, talk with my family, and I'll get back to you." I called him back within a day or two, I think, and I said, "I'm ready to help." Now, what happened in between that conversation and my call back to the governor was the gun control groups descended on Parkland. The media descended on Parkland. And the narrative started to develop very quickly. Some of it I was unaware of in the first few days, but very quickly the narrative was, we've got to ban assault weapons. We've got to restrict Second Amendment rights. We've got to, that became the cry of the activists that, contrary to what the public believes, even to this day, and many folks in Parkland still believe this, that it was this organic upswelling of residents of the area. These were groups that were flown in, big dollar groups brought
Mhm.
in to push a narrative to get um, those that were either involved or tangentially involved in front of microphones and cameras, and to start to call for uh, restrictions on our Second Amendment rights. And that, when I saw that happening, that's when I knew I needed to call the governor back and do what I could to help, because this was not, Elena was not uh, killed because of the Second Amendment. Elena was killed because evil exists in the world, number one. And number two, there were failures of local government to understand and recognize and do something about the warning signs. And I knew I needed to be a part of changing Florida so that this type of tragedy couldn't happen again.
Well, and that's interesting because it leads right into my next question. So you get to Tallahassee. You probably have some ideas in mind of what you would like to see in terms of maybe toughening up schools in terms of being targets. Obviously at that point they were very soft targets. But I'm curious, because now I've spent a couple years in Tallahassee and I can tell you, Ryan, I arrived in Tallahassee with some of the best of intentions. And once you start discussing those ideas, they quickly morph into things that either you don't recognize anymore, or sometimes they morph into things that you never asked for. And so I'm curious, your time in Tallahassee, did you think the politicians were actually listening to you? Or was it more of what you just described on the ground in part? Was it more, the activists are using this story. They're not seeking the changes we want. They're using our stories to get the changes they want.
Yeah, it felt, again, it was very surreal, and I wasn't sure what was on the table and what the options were. And again, I'll give leadership in Tallahassee at the time some credit for bringing me in and helping me understand what the possibilities were. Now, in the background, as you know, and I don't know that your viewers or listeners will know, there were some working groups working on, law enforcement groups, an education group, and a mental health group that were a task force, if you will, that the governor and the legislature had convened, and they were working on options. What could be done, right, within the realm of possibility? And so when I got up there, I was briefed on the output of the discussions that were going on with those groups, which was fantastic. What my experience, Dr. Redmond, to be honest with you, the governor was absolutely fantastic in helping me understand what the direction he wanted to go. He was willing to bring me along with him, and I would say that the leadership in both the House and the Senate were also very um, understanding of sort of where I was mentally, obviously, but bringing me
Right.
along and getting my input on what we did. The one area, and this may be your next question, and I may be jumping to that, but the one area where I expressed concern was over the lowering or the raising of the age, I should say, of being able to purchase a long gun in the state of Florida from 18 to 21. And just that was one of, that was the Second Amendment restrictions that are in that bill, were the area that I asked questions about. And Senator Scott knows that, I'm not saying anything he hasn't heard me say. And certainly Speaker Corcoran, who I have grown close to and had a good relationship with, um, um, there were some, I was told that there were some political expediencies that required that compromise to get the bill over the threshold to be able to get it passed and get it signed into law. I never quite understood those. I know the Republicans did not have the supermajority um, that 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 they have now in the legislature. But it always seemed to me that if we just stripped the Second Amendment restrictions out of the bill, Republicans could have very likely passed it. Now, that may not be exactly true. I'd have to go back and look at how the House and the Senate were divided up, but that was the explanation given to me, and that didn't feel right to me. It's always felt like we lost some Republicans. I mean, I sat in meetings with several conservatives that said, I'm so sorry for your loss. I really do want to do something here. 99% of this bill is fantastic and I'm behind it, but I cannot get behind the restrictions on the Second Amendment. And they were devastated to have to say that, because I met with them face to face with one of the other Parkland parents, Andrew Pollack. We sat in a room and met with these representatives. And I will say almost without exception. I won't say without exception, but almost without exception, they were willing to come in and have that tough conversation with these two parents. And I give them credit for coming in and saying that they couldn't vote for the bill because of the provision around the Second Amendment. And so that was a very long and winding explanation to your question, which is, I believe that leadership did a good job of trying to get the best package across the line as possible. But I was never comfortable with the Second Amendment restrictions or the explanation I was given for why they were included in the bill.
Well, and when you talk about these reservations, when you talk about how you already had some concern about how things were shaping up as a Second Amendment hill to fight on,
Mhm.
I talked to you earlier before we started recording that originally this interview, I wanted to have this interview as part of a bigger podcast addressing gun rights. But, right after preparing for the interview and now after hearing your responses, it kind of hit me. I'm not sure Parkland, and again, I mean, no offense to anyone, I'm not sure it's fair to summarize Parkland as a gun issue. I think this is much bigger than that. I think, as you alluded to, there were some failures at the local level, and if people aren't aware of that, I mean, it's well documented. I think it's fair to perhaps refer to it as a school safety issue. Yeah, as a doctor, my thoughts go to the mental health warning signs that were missed, and so I'd kind of like your opinion on that because, as you alluded to, it's almost as if the activists made this a gun issue.
100%. They made it a gun issue. Now, obviously, that was the weapon that was used to kill 17, injure 17 more, and attempt to take the lives of dozens of students and staff at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. So there's no question a gun was involved, but gun control is not the solution, and it wasn't at the heart of the issue here. What we have, Dr. Rudman, and this is why it's so important, and you alluded to this earlier, when you get to the legislature, you want to do good things, and all those good things, as a legislator, oftentimes those good things are passing new laws, right? Which every new law comes with unintended consequences.
Right.
And so some of what happened in Parkland is because of the unintended consequences of laws at both the state and federal level around education policy. Some of what happened at Parkland is because of mental health regulations and laws that have been passed at the federal level. And I lay a lot of the blame at the feet of the federal government and the impact that the federal government and Congress in particular has had on both the mental health, for lack of a better word, industry, but the mental health of American citizens, number one. And number two, the way we educate our kids and the environment we educate our kids. So And I'm writing a book about this where I'll go into a little bit more detail. It should be coming out later this year. And others have written about this. Andrew Pollack wrote a fantastic book digging into the failures around education policy. So, for example, the superintendent that was at Broward County Public Schools was a big proponent of what's called restorative justice and restorative justice practices. Really, what that was a euphemism for not separating actions and consequences for students in Broward County, which means, for those that are unfamiliar with restorative justice, it's a program that the left likes to use, which basically says kids are not responsible for their actions because of all these external environmental factors, including their race, their socioeconomic background, the zip code they live in, and all these other things. So when they do something wrong in school, we don't want to give them consequences for that. We want to mitigate those consequences as much as possible. And they do this because they are trying to stop what they call the school to prison pipeline. You may have heard that term, or your listeners may have heard that term, the school to prison pipeline. And really, nothing could be further from the truth. What, in fact, they are doing by not having consequences as a young person. This is when we learn our actions have consequences. And we do that as young people because the consequences aren't as impactful as they are when you turn 18 and become an adult. So really, this whole push to stop the school to prison pipeline is actually creating a school to prison pipeline in my mind. And what that is because our kids are becoming adults. They're going out into the real world. They're committing crimes, and they're ending up in the criminal justice system and in prison, for that matter, because they haven't learned how to act as a citizen, right? How to act as a student in school. And so this was core and fundamental to what was going on in Broward County at the time. It was put in place by the superintendent. It was bought into by the sheriff at the time. And basically what they did is decided that they were just going to stop arresting juveniles for this kind of behavior. Now, if you go back to the history of the killer in Parkland, Dr. Redman, clearly there were mental health issues from the time he was born moving forward, but he was known to be violent by the school district. He was known to be violent by law enforcement. And because the school district had this policy of not enforcing consequences, and because the sheriff's office didn't want to do their part, they wanted to stop arresting juveniles. There were never any consequences for this young man. Mm-hmm. So as he was growing up, he didn't get the feedback that you can't attack other students and get away with it. He didn't get the feedback that you can't attack your mother. He physically battered his mother on multiple occasions and was never arrested under domestic violence laws. I would have thought, I'm not a lawyer, but I would have thought that would be enough to get him put into a facility. And what we do know, that prior to the superintendent getting there, before some of these policies were put in place, he was moved to an alternative school where there were consequences and more strict discipline. And you know what happened? His behavior improved. His grades improved. Everything got better. And then he was shoved back into the school he was zoned for. And all of those supports, all of that structure was taken away from him. And so he started to act out again. And so I come back to this. These policies were all put in place because of federal regulations and federal policy that pushed for this kind of leniency in the way we enforce discipline in our schools. And that is a direct cause of what happened in Parkland. And so those policies, as well-intended as they may have been, and I actually don't think they were, I don't actually believe they're well-intended, but if they were well-intended, that had a tremendous impact And that's really the story in my mind. It's a failure of government and government policy. And if you want to believe it was done with good intentions, go ahead and believe it was done with good intentions. But whether it was done with good intentions or not, those federal policies impacted the ability for the mental health provider to act to stop this. They prevented the school district from having the right policies in place to stop this kind of thing, and um, they impeded law enforcement in many ways. Of course, these are leadership issues. These are choices that were made by the sheriff at the time, and these are choices that were made by the school district. But this is a failure of government, not a failure of the Second Amendment or gun control. That's the story of Parkland, and I wish everybody knew that.
Well, and of course, as a family physician, what you just said, Ryan, that really resonates with me because that's why I kind of went on my crusade as a state representative. As a physician, I can really speak to the lack of services and the lack of seriousness when it comes to mental health. Now, I know you're used to politicians, talking about being a mental health champion. Most of the politicians are referring to those people who are maybe going through a stressful period in their lives. Maybe they're talking more about a
Right.
depressed teenager or an anxious teenager. They're talking more about community outpatient services. In my time in the legislature, I focused on inpatient services because, as you say, there are people with mental health issues that will never be fixed, certainly not in an outpatient setting. And to ignore it, to sweep it under the rug, to have these people walking the streets and acting like they're not a time bomb waiting to go off, it's a disservice to most law abiding Americans. I can quickly give you two examples. But long before I got into politics, I had a patient here in my clinic who was a known schizophrenic. He had quit seeing a psychiatrist. He was off of all of his meds. He was here for a blood pressure check. And during his visit, he became very agitated, particularly when I asked why he wasn't seeing his psychiatrist. He stood up, punched his fist through my door, left a hole in my door, and he said, I'm going to go home and get my things and come back. He said, You're going to be very sorry. And so the gentleman left. We proceeded to call the sheriff's deputy. And do you know, Ryan, when the sheriff's deputy arrived, I asked for them to find this gentleman and place him under a Baker Act. He threatened to kill me and kill my staff. Would you be surprised to know that the sheriff deputy's response was laughter? He said, Oh, Dr. Rudman, he was just letting off steam. I said, what don't you understand? He's a schizophrenic, off his meds, with a past history. He's going home to get his weapon. He said he's going to come back and make us sorry. And the deputy said, Oh, Dr. Rudman, a person would have to be crazy to do that. And again, I was just flabbergasted. I was like, what part of this did you not understand? I think another thing that our listeners might be surprised to know. So when I became a state representative, it was at the top of my list to visit the Chattahoochee State Mental Hospital here in the Florida Panhandle. I wanted to see exactly what became of our asylum system. So, Ryan, when I get
Mm.
there, our asylum system as it currently stands is basically a holding cell for potential future prisoners. Basically, let's say if you have a person down in, let's say, Tampa, let's say you have a person who's wildly schizophrenic, untreatable, uncurable with medication. Let's say it's one of these people who is shoving innocents in front of an oncoming bus. They're trying to kill people. Well, what happens is they have to determine if this person is competent to stand trial or not. So a lot of times these people are sent to places like Chattahoochee in an effort to restore their mental faculties, in an effort to declare them competent to stand trial. Now, I always assumed, Ryan, that if a person was unfixable, I always assumed that their new home would just be Chattahoochee. I was surprised to find out after touring Chattahoochee Hospital three separate times I was surprised to learn that the actual policy is the psychiatrists in the state of Florida actually have a limited amount of time to restore competency. And if they claim that it's if they claim they're unable to make the patient competent to stand trial, they don't keep them in Chattahoochee. They release them back out into the community. And I don't think people realize that. It's not a question of does this person deserve prison or does this person deserve asylum? A lot of times the choices are they competent or do we just put them back in their community? And it's very unfortunate. And and that leads maybe to my next question because I don't want this podcast to necessarily be a running down of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Act. Again, I believe you and everyone else, all the politicians, I believe a lot of them had the best of intentions. Would you mind spending just a few minutes maybe talking about the good parts of the act? Of course, we can also talk about the bad parts of the act as you see them, because there were several pieces, including the red flag laws, including the increasing the purchase age of long guns from 18 to 21. There were definitely aspects that I wanted to repeal. But could you maybe let our viewers know of the good things, the school resource officers? There was, in fact, a focus on mental health. And maybe you could talk to some of those.
Absolutely. Um, and right before I do, let me mention the red flag law because it dovetails very nicely with what you just talked about with the mental health issues. So one of the things that one of the reasons cited for putting the red flag law in was to try to give law enforcement some additional tools because the Baker Act was. We heard testimony of this as the when I sat on the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Commission that the Baker Act's broken. And that
Yes.
a lot of times, by the time law enforcement Baker Acts somebody, the person, by the time they fill out the paperwork, the person's already being released, because if they can answer questions correctly,
Right.
it's a revolving door. And I don't think the public knows that. And it's, it's a piece of work that remains to be done, I'd say, in the state of Florida, because we have I would call it a mental health crisis, whether this is, regardless of the cause, whether these are drug-induced mental health issues or some other origin, we have folks running around in the state of Florida that have what I would call as a layman permanent mental health issues. They are not capable of treating themselves in an outpatient environment, which puts the burden back on the family to try to make sure they're taking their medication. And if and when they don't take their medication, then the community, the rest of us, pay the price. And so this dovetails into the red flag law because what we got wrong on the red flag law, well, first of all, there's the due process issues, which I'm uncomfortable with. I think this needs to be completely repealed. But if you were going to do something like a red flag law, why just pick on firearms, right? I could use a baseball bat. I could use a knife. I could use my automobile. We've seen these mentally disturbed people kill people with rental trucks and pickup trucks and cars. So taking one method away from a person that's having an episode, let's call it, is not going to protect the community. So I think we missed the mark 100% there. The second thing we did, Dr. Redmond, is we red flag somebody, we take their firearms away, which just adds to their anger, in my view, number one. And then there are no wraparound or treatment services offered, or there's nothing else to sort of get into that person's life and figure out what's causing the issue. It could be job loss. It could be frustrations at home. It could be drug abuse. There could be a number of issues that are the causes of the mental health. But we don't do that. We red flag somebody, we take their guns away, and we hope, in a couple of weeks or a year, they're no longer angry or a threat. And we do nothing for them. So that's my big problem with due process. So we don't do anything to actually help people. Let's talk about the good stuff that happened, though. Florida has absolutely led the way on school safety it's not even close. As I travel the country, there are states that are doing pieces of what we did in Florida, but nobody's done it as comprehensively. And as I travel and brag about Florida, you can see legislators from other states. They get a little uncomfortable, you know, when it's sort of like when Texas walks around and says we're Texas, or California says we're California. We're now at that point where we're Florida, right? And so they sort of maybe roll their eyes a little bit. But here's what we did that was great. We said every school needs to be protected by somebody carrying a firearm. And in many cases, that's a school resource officer.
Right.
But it's also very likely to be a Florida guardian. Now, a guardian, as your listeners probably know, or maybe they don't know, is somebody that's been trained to protect a school and with a firearm, and to stop a tragedy either before it starts or as soon as possible after it starts, because we know every second counts. Every second is another life that could be lost. And so many Florida schools have multiple armed individuals on the campus, which does two things. It stops the tragedy as quickly as possible, number one, and the more the better. The more the more of these guardians we have, and the better. But the second thing it does, it provides a deterrent. Everybody that thinks about attacking a school in the state of Florida knows that they're going to meet armed resistance, and most of these attackers are cowards, and they have no intention of they want to take out as many victims as possible, and they know they're going to meet resistance in a Florida school. So that Guardian program and SROs armed, we're protecting schools with firearms, good guy with a gun, whatever you want to call it. That's what we're doing in Florida. That's been a game changer for us. The second thing we've done, I think, which has been phenomenal, is just controlling who's on our campuses. And we do this through a variety of mechanisms. You'll remember the Parkland killer walked into the campus through an unlocked gate, an unmanned gate. And so now we have what was called single point of entry. We lock our gates. We have procedures to identify people coming onto the campus and what purpose they have to be there. And so we've eliminated a lot of opportunity for bad guys to come in and do harm on the campus. So that's been another important thing. The third thing you'll remember is he walked into the building through an unlocked door. And had he known that most of those classrooms were unlocked, we could have had, Parkland may have been more like Uvalde, with the shooter getting into a classroom, and it just would have been a tragedy on another scale. But we lock our classrooms in the state of Florida now. We lock our buildings, and you have to have permission to go in and out. Is it an inconvenience? Absolutely. Absolutely. Right? It's frustrating, I know, for students and staff to move between buildings and whatever, but it's keeping them safe, and that's been a game changer. The other thing that we do that these are my top three is in the realm of prevention. So we worked with the United States Secret Service. We put in what's called behavioral threat management, or what we call in Florida behavioral threat management. In other places in the country, it's called behavioral threat assessment and management. But the reason we call it behavioral threat management is because we want to focus on the management piece. This is where we're failing, as we talked about with the mental health of your average citizen. We actually actively manage known threats to our schools. And we have a great mechanism through social media and apps and just kids being comfortable telling adults. We learn about threats early. Those threats go to a threat management team at the school. That threat management team talks about it. They come up with a plan. They engage if necessary. And if a threat is deemed to be credible, law enforcement is consulted. And so what we don't do anymore, and this was, again, one of those bad federal policies where law enforcement was almost excluded from helping protect a campus by, quite frankly, the Obama administration, is where a lot of these bad policies came into place. Probably not a surprise to you, Dr. Redmond, or many of your listeners, but that's where a lot of these bad policies came into place. But now we're forcing collaboration with law enforcement. And we've taken the decision away from the school about whether or not a law has been broken. We don't leave that to the discretion of non-law enforcement. You and I voted, we enable our sheriffs as law enforcement. We enable our city police. Those are the agents of the government that are put in place to determine whether or not a crime has been committed. And of course, they take that to the state attorney that makes a determination about charging. That's the process that we as citizens have sanctioned in America, right? Not your principal or your vice principal or a teacher or whatever, right? That they're not law enforcement officers. So we don't do that anymore in Florida. It makes dealing with threats much more simple. And we have averted a number of what could have been Parkland style attacks. You probably heard stories about this when during your time in the legislature. I sit on the State Board of Education right now. I work with our Office of Safe Schools. I hear about events almost on a weekly basis where there's a threat to a school, and some of them have been very serious, incredible threats. But we have, and I'm knocking on wood, Dr. Redmond here,
Right.
but we have averted every threat that's come to a school here in Florida, and I'm very proud of that work. That's the good stuff that came out of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas bill. Armed security on our campuses, locking our schools, our doors and our fences, and making sure we know who's on the campus and whether they have permission to be there. And number 3, we learn about threats early and we deal with them. We don't let them fester until they turn into a tragedy.
Well, and Ryan, I think this is probably the part of the interview where I need to maybe come clean. I'm not sure you're aware of this. Like you, I also lost a family member to gun violence. I lost my older brother, Jerry. He lived up in the northeast part of the United States. He was shot in his own home by someone he knew. And I found out on my birthday, as luck would have it. I'm here in the very office you see behind me. I was sitting here seeing patients, and I get a call. It's from his house. I assume it's my brother calling to wish me happy birthday. It was actually the police telling me that they had found my brother dead in his garage. And so it's a blow. It's difficult to deal with. I had to travel up to Pennsylvania and uh, tour the house, examine that, see my brother's blood on the floorboards. So I only mention that just so the viewers know. You know, I never once blamed the gun for my brother's death. I never once blamed society. I never once blamed uh, the upbringing of a person. In my mind, there was one person to blame for my brother's death, and it was the person who pulled the trigger. Um, and so I bring that up because in your case, I'm sure you had media, I'm sure you had friends, I'm sure you had advocates coming to you telling you this is a gun problem, as we've already discussed. I'm curious, a lot of times the media will tell you it's our movies, it's our TV, it's our music. I have to throw music in there because I'm a huge music fan. My taste, Ryan, may not be yours, but I find it interesting. For example, Marilyn Manson grew up just a few miles from Parkland. He grew up in the Fort Lauderdale area. Um, People will try to blame musicians and artists and performers for the actions of individual men and women. And I push back on that. I don't blame the movies, just like I don't blame the gun. I don't blame someone like Marilyn Manson because for every coward that's facing the death penalty that claims he's not responsible for his or her own actions, I can point to millions of others who whose lives were saved by listening to music, by watching those movies. To them, it was a release to get them out of the angst that they were feeling. And so I'm curious, like I said, since we have that in common, did you ever feel a tendency to blame others, to blame media, to blame movies, to blame society, to blame music? And what were your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, Dr. Redmond, sorry to hear about the tragedy that befell you and your brother. And I didn't know that about you. And so we do share that in common. No, I look from the beginning. I didn't feel the gun was to blame. Right? Didn't much care what kind of gun it was. Didn't really matter, to be honest with you. Uh, I think, and there certainly was pressure. I talk about this in the book. There was a school board member that came to my home and tried to recruit me into the gun control movement. I mean, she said, "Well, obviously we've got a gun problem, so she was already in my mind looking for a scapegoat, right? Which is convenient for her because she didn't want to address the policy failures that the district had put
Right.
that she was responsible for. One of the leaders in the district that was responsible for that. So no, I don't. Unfortunately, it's too prevalent in our modern society that we look for the reasons to sort of divide up responsibility. Well, it was 3% Marilyn Manson's fault, and it was 7% this and whatever. At the end of the day, we're all human beings, and with the exception of those that we talked about previously that have a serious mental health issue that needs to be dealt with separately, that may not have the same ability to make a decision that you and I have. I guess the law calls that competence, right?
Right.
We all know right from wrong, and we all have the decision. The killer at Parkland walked into that school with a gun. He loaded that gun. But at some point, he had to decide to pull the trigger. And he had to look down the barrel of that gun and see another human being there. And what was going through his mind, I don't know. But he had to decide to commit that act. And no amount of music or no amount of video games or no amount of bad upbringing or whatever is an excuse in my mind for his decision to pull that trigger. And so, no, it's the person behind the gun. It's the person behind the baseball bat. It's the person, if you're in Europe and you can't get a gun, it's the person with the knife or the machete that's
Right.
indiscriminately killing people as they wait to board the metro. It's evil in the world. And unfortunately, in modern society, we look for complex answers to what should be simple, should be dealt with simply, which is this person committed a crime. It's unacceptable. They need to be put on trial and they need to face the consequences of that. As a society, I think we're suffering from a bit of a sickness where we do everything we can, Dr. Redmond, to separate the consequences from the action.
Right.
You see that, I'm sure, in medicine. We see that. You see that with the youth. You see that. Boy, I see it at work. You'll have employees that do something, and and like, well, it's not my fault because I didn't have the right software, or I didn't. You didn't give me permission to do what I needed to do, or whatever it is. Right? There's always an excuse. We've got to get away from that as a society. In my mind, we've got to get back to taking responsibility for our actions, and as uncomfortable as it is, owning when we make a mistake. We all make them. We should admit it and get more comfortable as a society. I think until we do that, it's going to be a challenge for us to I'll use a medical term here, to heal as a society, right?
So I agree 100%, and I'm certainly not letting society off the hook. Just because I don't blame an Ozzy Osbourne lyric or a song for an
Right.
outcome, it doesn't mean that we can't do better as a society. You know, immediately after the tragedy, you see the perpetrator's name in all the media. You don't see any mention of the victims, you know, and too often it seems like
Right.
the media, our culture almost glorifies that behavior. You know, if you're a
Yeah.
kid maybe and you're troubled and you want to be famous, you know, horrible acts like this seem a lot easier than actually studying your homework and becoming a doctor or a lawyer or a legislator. Uh, it may surprise you to know that I've literally heard kids in my office as they're preparing their applications for places like Harvard and Princeton, you know, and they have to write a personal essay. I have literally heard kids turn to their parents and say, why don't we have any tragedies in our lives that I can write about and get into this
Wow.
Ivy League school? So,
Wow.
what would your message be to us as a society? Because I definitely think we can do better and not glorify this sort of behavior.
Yeah, I think, boy, a prescription for society is what you're asking for, I guess, in a way. Couple of things. And we get blamed for doing this a lot as conservatives, right? Is looking back at our history and saying, um, I wish things were like they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago or something like that, right? That's the critique the left makes of us, right? Is and we can't go back, and you wouldn't want to go back anyway because things weren't as good back then. But we came. I look back at my heritage, right? I look back at um, some examples of some folks that lived through tragedy that makes what my wife and I and my family, what we've had to deal with, almost pale in comparison. I mean, infant mortality rates in the 1800s were, like, ha- I don't know, 40-50% of the kids were not surviving, past
Right.
a year old. And so parents like me um, dealt with the death of children on a frequent basis. Now it was different. It wasn't necessarily violent, and it wasn't necessarily so they certainly didn't have to deal with the media and the publicity that we deal with in the modern era. But I found strength, Dr. Rudman, in learning about their lives and their stories and some of the things that they went through, and any kind of writing that they've done I find strength in that. It helps me understand I can do hard things and I can get through hard things. Been incredibly helpful. Family. We've got to, as a society, get, we've got to value again the intact nuclear family. I get it. Everybody's situation's different, and of course, the examples of why that doesn't work, and there's abusive relationship. I get all of that, but it should be the norm. And then there are exceptions to that. What we've done as a society is we've said, well, because there are exceptions, we're no longer comfortable calling that the norm. And I think kids need to grow up in an environment where there's ideally a loving mother and father who are not treating them as are trying to be their kids' best friends, but are trying to actually be their parents. Um, that would go a long ways to solving problems in our society. Um, I mentioned this before, just taking responsibility for our actions and just saying, yeah, I did that. That's just refreshing when people do that nowadays. It's refreshing because it doesn't happen very often. It's usually preceded by 15 excuses why something didn't go the way the person thought it should, and just taking ownership for that. And then I think we have to, as a society, look less to government to solve our problems and get away from this idea that we need to bombard our legislators with, hey, wouldn't it be great if there was a law that did this, right? Just step back and say, hmm, yeah, but how many other problems? I'm going to solve one problem and create three more
Right.
with new legislation. So, sort of one of my heroes as I look back political heroes is Calvin Coolidge, right? Who famously said when he was asked about running for a second term, he said, "I choose not to run." And I admire that, because here's a man who ostensibly was the most powerful individual on the planet, even back in that day, pre-World War II. But he voluntarily gave up that power because he didn't think government was the answer to things. You had George Washington famously, give up power and transition. So we need to find examples, I think, back in history, whether they're our own familial examples or those that we can point to in popular culture, where people look to themselves to solve their own problems, look to family first, and then church and community second. And of course, government should be the last option, because it's almost always the worst option.
Well, and and maybe little things that we could all do. Maybe little things matter as well. Just we've made it almost an hour here of talking, and we've mentioned Elena's name. I've mentioned Gina's name.
Mhm. Yep.
Not once have we mentioned the perpetrator's name, and maybe that's how it
Mhm.
should be. I mean,
Yep.
because that I think little actions like that mean a lot. Don't give them the fame that they wanted. Uh, let's recognize the true heroes of that day. And speaking of
Yeah.
which, I want to give you one last question, Ryan. I promise I'll let you go. Uh, I actually spoke in debate a couple years back on the House floor when we were trying to repeal the 18 to 21 restriction. Uh, I actually described what happened that day, which is where I got a lot of blowback being a Republican, describing
Mhm.
the tragedy of Parkland. And, the irony was not lost on me that you had people that day like Anthony Borges, who allegedly was holding a classroom door closed so the perpetrator could not get into that classroom, and he took a lot of bullets for holding that door closed. And the irony was not lost on me that the way we rewarded Anthony was by stripping him of his Second Amendment rights for an extra 3 years. And so when we think about your daughter, when we think about my brother, uh, don't we owe it to the victims to make the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Act a better bill? You have repeal bills every year that are trying to solve the red flag laws, get those out of there, trying to restore the gun age to its rightful 18-year-old situation. Isn't it only fair and just that our legislators try to make this act a fitting memorial to the victims? Because right now, and I'm sure um, depending on where you are, depending on who you're talking to, you may mention the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Act and have people applaud, but you may have people up here in my part of Florida, in the Florida Panhandle, when they hear Marjory Stoneman Douglas Act, they think of all the negative things, all the rights they used to have that now they don't. Don't we owe it to the victims to clean this law up? To with hindsight, go back and look at those parts that maybe were an overreach. Don't we owe it to the victims to restore those rights that are fundamental to each and every American? And wouldn't that be a more fitting memorial? And let me throw in one other thing, because we are in the political season. People are already running for governor of this great state. One man that I was lucky to serve with was Paul Renner. He was my Speaker of the House.
Mm.
Paul is catching flack for a vote he took as a freshman legislator in favor of this legislation. Although the entire time I knew Speaker Renner, the last 2 years when I was there, 22 to 24, Speaker Renner did everything in his power to make this a fitting memorial. He tried to get those overreaches out of the bill. He allowed me to file my Second Amendment bills. And it wasn't something he tolerated, it was something he encouraged. Do you forgive him for some of those overreaches? Because I truly believe in his heart, he is a Second Amendment champion. And number two, do you also agree that we owe it to the victims of this tragedy to make this a better statute?
Well, the easy one for me, the first one is just, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I never wanted my daughter's memory to be associated with gun control. In fact, as you know, Dr. Rudman, because we've talked about this before, one of my daughter's favorite things to do was to go shooting with dad. I mean, she
Mm.
absolutely, I think she would shudder at the thought that her name was being used for gun control. That was one of the, by the way, that was one of the motivators for me to jump in and help, you know, as much as I could to get anything but gun control passed. And unfortunately, you know, gun control snuck in to some of the bills. Do I hold Speaker Renner or any of the legislators? No, absolutely not. Coming off off of that tragedy was a unique time in the legislature. I have heard from legislators that have been there, you know, had been there for a long time, or it was unlike anything that they had witnessed. And Florida goes through some tragedies. I mean, we've got hurricanes and everything else that goes on around here. So um, it was an unusual and very unique time. Um, Speaker Renner and I have been very close. In fact, he helped me. He was one of the one of the first folks to help me when I tried to run for school board to try to solve some of the problems down in Broward. He was right there by my side, helping me with that. So no, Speaker Renner has been absolutely phenomenal. I don't know why the majority of Republicans, I'm assuming it's a majority, but some Republicans in Tallahassee, let me say it that way, are not willing to go back in and open the patient up and fix the last parts of this. In my mind, restoring the age absolutely shouldn't have been a question. I supported your bill. You know that. You were able to tell people, look, this Parkland parents support this. The red flag laws is going to be a little bit more challenging because I know the sheriffs in the state support it. They like it. It's a new, you know, it. But again, I think the real solution for the sheriffs is not the red flag law, but it's actually fix the Baker Act issues and the other
Right.
things that if somebody is a threat or threatening somebody, there are laws on the books today that law enforcement can use to deal with the problem. They don't have to go through this red flag path, in my mind, to solve the problem, even though it's administratively easier for them to do so, which is why I think they love, or why they, I won't say love, which is why I think they use the red flag provision so often. But yes, we should clean this bill up. The parts that are protecting Florida schools are the parts you and I talked about. It's having armed security. It's locking the doors. It's the prevention that we've done. It's the focus on 7 years later, actually 8 years later, we still have a governor that's pushing for additional school safety measures. And he's holding the Florida Department of Education accountable for making sure Florida schools are safe. So those are the good parts of the bill. Those are the parts that need to stay. The rest of it, the red flag laws and raising the age from 18 to 21 have not done anything to make Florida schools safer.
Ryan, I always appreciate talking to you. I did appreciate your support when I was in the Florida House, and hopefully our viewers have learned a lot from our talk today. Thank you so much, and I wish you the
You
best
bet.
for this upcoming weekend.
Yeah, all right. You too. Thank you for having me.